What if freedom is not something you earn from the world, but something you first dare to assume within yourself? That is where the real test begins. Not when life becomes easy, not when conditions improve, not when evidence appears, but when everything around you still says no, and you decide not to let that be final. Because most people do not understand what truly imprisons them. They think of prison only as walls, bars, locked doors, visible restrictions. But the deepest prison is always psychological. It is the state you accept as yourself. It is the concept you keep returning to. It is the arrangement of mind that says, this is who I am. This is what is possible. This is where I stop. And that arrangement feels solid only because you have lived in it long enough to call it reality. But it is still only an arrangement. Just as steel can be magnetized or demagnetized without changing its substance, your life can appear powerful or powerless, affluent or lacking, free or trapped. Not because you are made of something different from another person, but because the inner structure has been arranged differently. The rich man, the poor man, the celebrated man, the forgotten man, they are not different beings in essence. They are different configurations of the same one consciousness. There is only one power, only one being, only one I am. So when you say I am, and another says I am, it is not two separate sources speaking. It is the same being wearing different arrangements of identity. An identity is arrangement. Concept of self is arrangement. Destiny, in the way most people experience it, is nothing more than a repeated arrangement that is hardened into visible form. This is why you are never really asked to become someone else. You are asked to rearrange the structure of yourself. That is the deeper meaning of inner transformation, not self-rejection, not becoming unreal, not pretending to be superior, but reordering consciousness, turning the molecules of identity in one direction instead of another. And when they become one-pointed, power appears, not because power was added, because contradiction was removed. Let not the double-minded man think he will receive anything. Why? Because a divided state cannot project a clear world. One part of you says yes, another part still kneels before the evidence of no. One part imagines freedom. Another part continues to identify as bound. And reality faithfully echoes the division. So the real question is not whether you desire a different life. Almost everyone does. The real question is whether you can look into what might be called the perfect law of liberty, the inner law that frees by assumption and remain there long enough for it to become your natural state. Are you trying to change circumstances or rearrange identity? Because circumstances are only the visible result of a state already occupied. If you are imprisoned by debt, by fear, by rejection, by limitation, by a life that does not reflect what you know is possible, then the first mistake is to believe the condition is the cause. It is not. The condition is the reflection of an arrangement already accepted within. And if it was accepted, it can be rearranged. This is where most people stop. They hear the principle, admire it, maybe even agree with it for a moment, but they do not do it. They remain hearers. And a hearer can be fascinated for years while remaining unchanged. A hearer collects insight. A doer enters a state. A hearer says, that sounds beautiful. A doer says, tonight I will test it. This must become practical or it is nothing. What are you assuming right now? Not in some grand spiritual sense, in the most immediate and honest sense. What are you assuming about your life, about your body, about your future, about your worth, about what is possible for you? Because those assumptions are not passive, they are structural. They are arranging the mind from which your world is reflected. If you continue to assume bondage, then even your prayers for freedom are spoken from within the prison. And prayer from within the prison still carries the feeling of imprisonment. But if you look into the law of liberty and dare to assume that you are already free, something begins to shift. Not outside first, inside. The rearrangement begins there. The self starts to loosen. The old concept no longer has your full consent. Another state begins to take shape, and with it another world. This is why imagination is not escape. It is rearrangement. It is the deliberate reordering of identity according to the end you choose. If you were free, where would you sleep? This is not a poetic question. It is a doorway. Because the moment you ask it seriously, you are no longer discussing freedom as an abstract hope. You are locating yourself in it. If you were already free, where would your body rest tonight? What room would hold you? What atmosphere would surround you? What sounds would be near you? What would the night feel like if the condition were already dissolved? And then comes the real step. Sleep there inwardly. Not tomorrow, not after permission. Now, close the senses against the tyranny of appearances and occupy the state. Let the bars remain, if they must, in the visible world for a little while longer. That is not your concern in the imaginal act. Your concern is to rearrange the structure of mind by assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled. You are not asked to explain how. You are asked to occupy where. This is why reason often resists the imaginal act. Reason is built out of what you already know. It extracts conclusions from visible premises. It says, this is the sentence. This is the pattern. This is the evidence. Therefore, this is the future. But reason based only on current evidence is merely loyalty to yesterday's arrangement. It is not wisdom. It is repetition. When you know more, reason changes. And how do you know more? By testing the law. By proving inwardly that assumption precedes fact. By discovering through your own experience that perception is not limited to the senses, and reality is not confined to what the senses report. The moment you prove this once, your entire relationship with what seems possible begins to shift. You are no longer dealing with theories. You are dealing with law. Are you waiting or already being? Because waiting is secretly agreement with delay. Waiting says, I am not yet the one. Being says, I dare to occupy it now. Waiting asks the outer world for permission. Being consults only the inner state. Waiting keeps checking the cell. Being sleeps in the home beyond it. This is why persistence matters so deeply. Not because reality is cruel, but because identity hardens by repetition. If you assume tonight and forget tomorrow, you have visited the state but not dwelt there. If 1 hour later you are back to feeling yourself as bound, then you have looked in the mirror and forgotten your face. You have heard but not done. The doer persists, not with strain, with fidelity. The doer returns again and again to the chosen arrangement until the inner state becomes more convincing than the old evidence. And once that happens, the world begins to shift. Because it has no choice, it is reflecting structure. It is obeying arrangement. It is echoing the concept of self you have made dominant. So the lesson is not merely imagine, it is rearrange. Rearrange the room of mind. Rearrange the self you keep inhabiting. Rearrange the inner furniture of identity until the whole place reflects the one you desire to be. Keep what is lovely. Move what is limiting. Remove what belongs to the old state. Bring everything into alignment with the end. Because the man you want to be is not elsewhere. He is a different arrangement of the same I am. And the woman you want to be is not waiting in time. She is an inner order you can assume now. This is the practical mystery. You do not need another mind. You need another arrangement. And that arrangement begins the moment you stop merely listening and start living from the state you have chosen. The reason this law feels difficult at first is not because it is complicated. It is because it is direct. It removes excuses. It does not ask whether the world agrees with your desire. It asks whether you do. It does not ask whether circumstances are favorable. It asks whether you can persist in the state that implies fulfillment, even while circumstances still deny it. And that is where most people discover the true nature of their faith. Because faith is not what you say you believe when everything looks possible. Faith is what you continue to assume when appearances offer you no support. This is why the difference between a hearer and a doer is everything. A hearer enjoys the idea. A doer inhabits it. A hearer says, yes, that is a beautiful principle. A doer says, tonight I will sleep in the end. A hearer wants results. A doer rearranges identity. And identity is what produces results. This is why the law of liberty is so exact. It does not free you by argument. It frees you by assumption. The moment you assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled, you have already stepped out of the prison inwardly. And if you persist there, the outer world must eventually reflect the change. Not because you forced it, because you became it. What are you assuming right now? That question returns again. Because this is not about one imaginal act done once and forgotten. It is about occupancy. It is about where consciousness lives after the technique is over. It is about the inward residence you return to when the room is quiet and there's no one to impress. If you assume freedom for 5 minutes and bondage for the remaining day, the deeper arrangement has not changed. If you imagine abundance at night and identify with lack by morning, you have not persevered in the law. You have visited a room and then moved back into the old one. Perseverance is not intensity, it is continuity. This is why the unstable mind receives nothing. Not because life is withholding from it, but because an unstable state cannot impress itself deeply enough upon consciousness to externalize. One moment the person feels chosen, the next moment forgotten. One moment wealthy, the next deprived. One moment free, the next resigned. And the world, faithful to the inner wavering, keeps returning mixed results, delays, inconsistencies, partial movements that never fully solidify. A divided mind produces divided reality. So the invitation is simpler than people want it to be. Choose. Choose the state. Choose the concept of self. Choose what you are willing to call yourself inwardly. Not later. Not when proof arrives. Now. Let the weak man say, I am strong. Notice the daring in that. Not, I hope to become strong. Not, I will be strong someday. But I am. The transformation begins in identification, not in outward evidence. The statement is created because it arranges consciousness. It turns the molecules of identity in a new direction. And if persisted in, that new direction becomes power. Are you waiting for proof or giving reality a new arrangement? Because proof belongs to the reflection. Arrangement belongs to the source. Most people still live as if visible facts are the authority. They say, how can I assume I am free when I still owe money? How can I assume I am loved when no one has called? How can I assume I am successful when nothing has changed? But this is the old logic speaking, the logic that gives the mirror the authority of the face. The mirror has no authority. It only reveals what stood before it. And if what stood before it changes, the reflection must follow. This is why you must stop consulting appearances as though they were causes. They are not causes. They are reports. They are delayed reports of states formerly occupied. Useful perhaps as information, but useless as identity. The moment you let a condition tell you who you are, you become its servant. The moment you assume a new state in spite of it, you become the source again. If it were already true, how would you think tonight? Not tomorrow, when the world perhaps begins to shift. Tonight, would you think of yourself as trapped? Would you rehearse old disappointments? Would you keep asking how it will happen? Would you lie down as the same self who has suffered the same pattern for years? No. You would think from the end. You would let the fulfilled state become your mental atmosphere. You would walk inwardly through the room that belongs to the new identity. You would touch it with consciousness. You would feel its naturalness. You would let the arrangement become so vivid inwardly that the old one begins to lose its hold. This is not make-believe. It is inner relocation. And relocation changes perception. Once you move into a new state, you begin to see the same world differently. What once looked like finality becomes transition. What once felt like rejection becomes redirection. What once appeared immovable begins to feel strangely temporary. Not because you are lying to yourself, but because you are no longer reading life from the old arrangement. The moment identity shifts, meaning shifts. And this is why the practice is so practical. It does not require special credentials. It does not require permission from society. It does not require that you know the right people, hold the right title, or possess the right amount of money. It asks only this: can you assume the feeling of being the one you desire to be, and can you remain there? That is all. Yet it is everything. Because the whole world of change hangs upon that fidelity. One mind arranged as failure becomes failure. The same mind arranged as freedom becomes freedom. The same mind arranged as wealth becomes wealth. The same mind arranged as love becomes love. There are not many minds. There are many arrangements of the one mind. So the feeling of inferiority, of delay, of limitation, of bondage, none of these are your essence. They are arrangements you have accepted long enough to call me. But an arrangement is not an identity eternal. It is a pattern of inner agreement. An agreement can be withdrawn. What if nothing needs to change first except your arrangement of self? That question is liberating because it returns power to where it belongs. It means you do not have to wait for the world to become favorable before you can begin. You do not need proof to assume. You do not need evidence to enter the state. You do not need unanimous support from other people. You do not even need to explain yourself. Your only responsibility is to select the end and dwell there. This is also why looking back is so dangerous. The old story calls to you because it is familiar. The past self wants to preserve itself. It wants you to revisit the wound, the sentence, the humiliation, the pattern, the memory, the evidence. It says, be reasonable. This is what happened. This is who you are. And if you turn back inwardly, you preserve the old state. You salt it. You keep it alive through remembrance and re-identification. But if you refuse to turn back, if you continue forward in assumption, the old arrangement begins to lose its vitality. It no longer receives your consent. It no longer receives your attention. It no longer has the emotional charge that once sustained it. And what is not fed, fades. So persistence is really a refusal to return, not a strained mental effort, a refusal to return, a refusal to let yesterday define today's self-concept, a refusal to let appearances rewrite the end, a refusal to kneel before what you are leaving. Are you trying to make something happen or remaining faithful to who you now are? Because that distinction matters. The one who is trying is still subtly admitting separation. The one who remains faithful has already crossed the bridge inwardly. They are not begging reality to change. They are resting in the change already accepted. And from there, life begins to reorganize. Sometimes quietly, sometimes through strange channels, sometimes through people who believe the idea was theirs, sometimes through events that make no sense at first. But the arrangement is working beneath the surface. Reality is not being forced, it is being repatterned. This is why you must not be discouraged if the old facts still stand tomorrow. Facts are slower than identity. They are the trailing edge of consciousness. What matters is whether you are still dwelling in the new arrangement when they do. If you are, they cannot remain forever as they are. They must yield because they are not self-existent. They are sustained by state, and state has changed. This is the great practical secret. You do not need another world. You need another arrangement of the same one mind. And the moment you accept that, the question is no longer whether freedom is possible. The question is whether you will persevere in being free before the world agrees. There comes a moment where the teaching stops being inspirational and becomes confronting. Because if imagination truly creates reality, then you can no longer blame life in the same way. You can no longer say, this just happened to me. You must begin to ask a deeper question. What have I been consenting to inwardly? without realizing it. This is not about guilt. It is about awareness. Because the moment you see that your inner state is the source, you also see that change is not outside your reach. It is not locked behind permission, timing, or luck. It is already within your ability, but only if you are willing to take responsibility for what you are imagining day after day. Look carefully at your inner conversations. What do you repeat when no one is listening? What scenes do you replay? What emotions do you rehearse? What identity do you quietly return to? Because those are not random thoughts. They are acts of creation. Most people imagine unconsciously. They rehearse failure. They anticipate rejection. They expect delay. They relive pain. They justify limitation. And then they wonder why life keeps reflecting the same pattern. But imagination is not neutral. It is always shaping. So the real shift begins when you become deliberate, when you no longer let the mind drift back into old arrangements, but begin to choose what you dwell in, not once, but repeatedly. This is why discipline is not about forcing yourself. It is about returning to the chosen state, again and again and again, even when it feels unnatural at first, because of course it feels unnatural. You are leaving a state you've occupied for years. You are stepping into a version of yourself that your senses have not yet confirmed. So there is a gap, a tension, a moment where the old self still feels more real than the new one. And this is where most people stop. They say it doesn't feel real. It feels fake. I can't believe it yet. But that moment is the doorway. Because reality is not determined by what feels familiar. It is determined by what is persisted in. Familiarity is just repetition. Truth in this law is what you sustain. So instead of asking, does it feel real? Ask, am I willing to remain here until it becomes real? That changes everything. Because now you are no longer waiting for belief. You are building it through persistence, through occupancy, through returning to the state until it becomes natural. Let me ask you something directly. If you were already the person you want to be, would you still be thinking the same thoughts you are thinking now? Would you still be doubting? Would you still be worrying? Would you still be checking for proof? Would you still be telling the same story about your life? Or would your thinking be different? Your reactions different? Your inner tone different? That is the key. You are not trying to change the world. You are changing the inner atmosphere from which you experience it. And once that atmosphere changes, everything begins to reorganize around it. This is why Neville insists you must live in the end, not visit it, not admire it, not think about it occasionally. Live in it. What does that actually mean? It means you think from it, not of it. There is a massive difference. Thinking of it says, I want this. I hope this happens. I'm trying to get there. Thinking from it says, this is who I am. This is already true. This is my reality now. One keeps desire alive. The other fulfills it inwardly. And once it is fulfilled inwardly, the outer world begins catching up. But here is where subtle mistakes happen. People imagine once and then spend the rest of the day contradicting it. They assume at night and doubt all morning. They feel it for a moment and then go back to the old identity. And then they say, it didn't work. But the law did not fail. The occupation was not maintained. You cannot plant a seed and dig it up every hour to check if it's growing. You cannot assume a state and abandon it the moment reality hasn't caught up yet. That is not persistence. That is interruption. An interruption delays manifestation. So the question becomes, can you remain faithful to an unseen reality long enough for it to become seen? Because everything visible was once invisible. Everything real was once imagined. Everything solid was once assumed. So when you imagine, you are not escaping reality. You are initiating it. Now think about this. Is there anything in your life right now that was not first imagined in some way? The clothes you wear, the place you live, the technology you use, the path you've taken. At some point, it existed only in someone's mind, and then it became fact. So why would your future be any different? Why would your desired life require a different law? It doesn't. The only difference is whether you apply it consciously or leave it to habit. And habit is simply imagination repeated unconsciously. So now you have a choice. You can continue imagining by default, or you can begin imagining by decision. You can let old patterns run, or you can deliberately rearrange the structure of your mind. You can keep reacting to life, or you can begin creating from within. But understand this clearly. No one will do this for you. No one can assume for you. No one can persist for you. No one can occupy the state for you. Because this is not about information. It is about application. And application is always personal. So tonight is not just another idea. It is an invitation to stop waiting, to stop observing, to stop hoping, and to start being right now. So now the question becomes even more precise. If you truly understand that imagination creates reality, why do you still return to the old version of yourself? Because that is the real struggle. Not understanding the law, but remaining faithful to it when nothing on the outside has changed yet. This is where the separation happens between those who hear and those who become. Because anyone can feel inspired for a moment. Anyone can imagine for a few minutes. Anyone can say, this makes sense. But very few will persist when the world still shows them the opposite. And that is exactly where the transformation is decided. Not when it's easy, or when it feels like nothing is happening. Let me show you something subtle. The moment you assume a new state, there is a transition period, a bridge, not a visible one, an invisible rearrangement. And during this time, your senses will try to pull you back. They will say nothing has changed. Be realistic. Don't fool yourself. Look at the evidence. And if you listen, you return. You go back to the old identity. And the moment you return, the old reality continues. Not because it is stronger, but because you re-entered it. This is why persistence is everything. Because persistence is not forcing something to happen. It is refusing to go back. Refusing to abandon the new identity. Refusing to agree with the old story. Refusing to let appearances decide who you are. So the real question is not, can this work? The real question is, can I remain in the state long enough without collapsing back? Because collapse is easy. It is familiar. It feels logical. But it is also the reason nothing changes. Now understand this. Every state has a feeling, not just a thought, a feeling. And that feeling is the key. Because you don't become what you think occasionally. You become what you feel yourself to be repeatedly. So if you want to change your life, you must change the feeling of who you are. Not force it, not fake it, but enter it. If you were already successful, what would your inner world feel like? If you were already free, what would your mind feel like at night? If you were already loved, what tone would your thoughts carry? If you were already at peace, how would your body relax into that knowing? These are not abstract questions. They are doorways, because the moment you answer them honestly, you can enter that state. And once you enter it, your only job is to remain. Not perfectly, but consistently. Because consistency builds naturalness. And naturalness is what makes it real. At first, the new state feels unfamiliar. Almost like you're stepping into someone else's life. But if you stay there, it begins to feel like home. And when it feels like home, that's when reality begins to mirror it. This is why Neville said, you must sleep in the assumption. Because sleep is where resistance drops. It is where the subconscious accepts. It is where the new arrangement sinks deeper. So the question is, who are you being as you fall asleep? The old self, replaying problems, rehearsing fears, feeling stuck, or the new self, already fulfilled, already free, already living the life you chose, because that moment is powerful. You are impressing identity, and identity becomes experience. Now here is something most people overlook. You don't need to force the how. You don't need to figure out the path. You don't need to control the steps, because once the state is assumed, life organizes itself around it. People move, opportunities appear, situations shift, doors open, sometimes in ways you never could have predicted. This is what many call the bridge of incidents, a series of events that leads you naturally to the fulfillment of your assumption. But here's the key. You don't build the bridge consciously. You walk it. And you can only walk it if you remain in the state. Because if you drop the state, you step off the bridge. So trust is not about hoping something will happen. Trust is about remaining in who you are becoming. Even when you don't see the path yet. Even when it doesn't make sense. Even when things temporarily seem worse. Because sometimes movement looks like disruption. Sometimes progress looks like loss. Sometimes the old must break to make space for the new. And if you don't understand this, you might think it's failing when it's actually rearranging. So don't panic. Don't retreat. Don't go back. Stay in the assumption. Now let's make this even more real. Right now, there is something you want. Be honest. Don't filter it. Don't shrink it. Don't justify it. Just name it. What do you want? Clarity matters, because a vague desire creates a vague state, but a clear desire creates a clear identity. An identity is what manifests. So once you know what you want, ask yourself, if this were already true, who would I be? Not what would I get, who would I be? Because that is the shift from chasing to becoming, from wanting to being, from waiting to occupying. And once you answer that, a step into it. Now, not later, not when it feels easier. Now, because the moment you step into it, you begin the rearrangement. And once the rearrangement begins, the world has no choice but to follow. Now we arrive at something most people quietly avoid: responsibility. Not the heavy kind the world talks about, but the creative kind. Because the moment you truly accept that your inner state shapes your reality, you also realize something uncomfortable. You can no longer blame circumstances the same way. You can no longer say, this happened to me. I had no control. It's just the way life is. Because if imagination is the operant power, then something in you has been participating all along. Not consciously perhaps, but consistently. And consistency creates patterns. So the real shift begins when you stop asking, why is this happening to me? And start asking, what am I returning to inwardly that keeps recreating this? That question changes everything. Because now you are not a victim of repetition. You are the source of it. And if you are the source, you can change it. But here is where honesty is required. Because many people say they want change, but they are still emotionally attached to the old story. They keep revisiting it, rehearsing it, explaining it, justifying it. And every time they do, they are re-entering the old state. You cannot hold on to the old identity and expect a new reality. You must release it inwardly. Not fight it, not suppress it, but stop feeding it. Because what you feed persists. What you withdraw from fades. So the real question becomes, what are you still emotionally loyal to? Is it the story of struggle, the identity of being overlooked, the feeling of not enough, the belief that things are always hard for you? Because even if you say you want something different, if you keep returning to those feelings, that is the state you are sustaining. And the law is faithful. It will continue to express whatever you are loyal to inwardly. Not what you wish for occasionally, not what you say you want, but what you consistently feel yourself to be. This is why letting go is not about effort. It is about withdrawal of identity. You simply stop being that person. You stop returning to that version of yourself. You stop telling that story internally, and instead you begin to occupy a new one. Now understand this clearly. You don't change your life by fighting the old state. You change it by abandoning it quietly, internally, consistently, because fighting keeps it alive, but indifference starves it. So if an old thought appears, but you don't panic, you don't analyze it, you don't argue with it, you simply don't move into it. You return to your chosen state again and again and again. This is mastery. Not controlling every thought, but choosing where you remain. Because remaining is what creates reality. Now here is something powerful. You are always imagining, even when you think you are not. When you worry, you are imagining. When you fear, you are imagining. When you replay negative scenarios, you are imagining. So the question is not, am I imagining? The question is, what am I imagining? And am I aware of it? Because unconscious imagination creates unwanted reality. Conscious imagination creates desired reality. And awareness is the difference. So now, you begin to watch yourself. Not with judgment, but with clarity. You begin to notice, where does my mind go when I'm not paying attention? What identity do I default to? What feeling do I return to most often? Because that is your current state. And your state is your life. So if you don't like your life, you don't fight the life. You change the state. Now let's go deeper. There is a difference between wanting something and being it. Wanting says, I don't have it yet. Being says, it is already mine. Wanting keeps distance alive. Being removes it. And imagination operates from being, not wanting. This is why you must stop trying to get something and start identifying as the one who already has it. That is the shift. From desire to identity. From seeking to occupying. From hoping to knowing. And this knowing is not intellectual. It is felt, it is quiet, stable, certain, not loud, not forced, just natural. And that is how you know you are in the right state. It feels normal, not exciting, not dramatic, just right. Now here is where many people get confused. They think they need to feel intense emotion. They think they need to be constantly excited or positive, but that is not it. The true feeling of the wish fulfilled is often calm, simple, ordinary. Because when something is truly yours, you don't get emotional about it. You rest in it. So don't chase intensity, chase naturalness. Ask yourself, does this feel like me now? And if it doesn't yet, stay with it until it does. That is persistence. Now one more thing. You don't need to convince anyone else. You don't need validation. You don't need approval. Because this work is internal. And the moment you start looking outside for confirmation, you weaken the state. Because now you are saying, I will believe it if I see it. But the law says you will see it if you believe it. So the direction matters. Inside, outside. Not the other way around, always. So tonight, this is your work. Become aware of your current state. Decide who you want to be. Assume that identity. Feel it as real. And remain there. Not perfectly, but persistently. Because persistence is what turns assumption into fact. Now we move into something even deeper. Why does this actually work? Not as a belief, not as motivation, but as a law. Because if you understand why, your confidence becomes stable. And when confidence is stable, persistence becomes natural. Here is the truth most people overlook. You are not reacting to reality. You are reacting to your interpretation of it. And that interpretation is coming from your state. Two people can experience the same situation and live completely different realities. Why? Because they are not seeing the world as it is. They are seeing the world as they are. Your state is a filter, a lens, a silent interpreter. It decides what things mean. It decides what stands out. It decides what feels possible and what feels impossible. So when you change your state, you are not just changing how you feel, you are changing how you perceive reality itself. And perception drives behavior. Behavior creates outcomes. Outcomes reinforce belief. And the cycle continues. This is why most people stay stuck. They are living in a loop. Old identity, old perception, old reaction, old results. Reinforced identity. And because it feels consistent, they call it reality. But it is only a loop of assumption. So when you assume a new state, you interrupt that loop. You introduce a new starting point, new identity, new perception, new reaction, new outcomes, new reinforcement. And this is how reality changes, not by force, but by shifted origin. Now here is something powerful. The world does not change first. You do. And then the world reflects it. But because people are used to seeing the world first, they think nothing is happening. They say, I don't see any change. But they're looking in the wrong place. The first change is internal, subtle, invisible, but real. You begin to think differently, feel differently, react differently, see things differently, and that is the beginning. Because once that changes, the external cannot remain the same. It may take time to reorganize, but it must reorganize because the source has changed. Now let's talk about something critical. Doubt. Doubt is not your enemy. It is simply the echo of your old state. It shows up because you have lived in that identity for a long time. So when you assume something new, the old self responds. It says, this isn't true. This won't work. You've tried before. Be realistic. And if you don't understand this, you will think something is wrong. But nothing is wrong. You are just transitioning. So instead of fighting doubt, you ignore its authority. You don't argue with it. You don't try to eliminate it. You simply don't return to it. You stay in the new state. Because the more you stay, the weaker the old voice becomes. Not instantly, but gradually, until one day it no longer feels convincing. Now here's a key insight. You don't need to feel 100% belief. You need to feel enough certainty to remain. That's it. Because belief grows through experience, and experience comes from persistence. So don't wait to feel ready. Start where you are. Assume anyway. Remain anyway. Persist anyway. And belief will follow. Now let's talk about time. Because this is where many people lose faith. They assume something and then they start watching the clock. How long will this take? Why hasn't it happened yet? When will I see results? And the moment they do that, they step out of the state. Because the fulfilled version of you is not waiting. They're already living it. So when you worry about time, you are identifying with lack, not fulfillment. This is subtle, but powerful. Because time anxiety equals separation from the state. So instead, you must collapse time internally. You live as if it is already done. Not pretending, but assuming. And when you do that, time becomes irrelevant. Because you're no longer waiting for the future. You are occupying it now. And when you occupy it now, the future reorganizes to match. Now here is something that will change how you see everything. You don't attract what you want. You reflect what you are. This is not about attraction. It is about expression. The world expresses your state. So if you feel lack, you will see lack. If you feel abundance, you will begin to see opportunities. If you feel rejected, you will notice rejection. If you feel valued, you will experience validation. Same world, different state, different experience. So the work is not outside, it is always inside. Now let's make this real. Think about something in your life right now that feels stuck. Something that hasn't changed. Something that feels frustrating. Now ask yourself, what version of me is experiencing this? Not what situation, what identity, because that identity is the key. And once you see it, you can change it. You don't fix the situation. You outgrow it by becoming someone else internally. And when you become someone else, the old situation no longer fits. It dissolves, shifts, or disappears, because it cannot exist in your new state. This is not magic, it is alignment. Now here is the most important part of this entire teaching. You are always choosing a state, even when you think you are not, even when you are passive, even when you are unaware. You are choosing through attention, through feeling, through identification. So the real question is, are you choosing consciously or unconsciously? Because unconscious choice creates unwanted reality. Conscious choice creates desired reality. So from this moment forward, you begin to choose deliberately who you are, how you feel, what you assume, and you stay there, because staying there is what creates. Now everything comes down to one final shift, from understanding the law to trusting yourself enough to live by it. Because at this point you already know what to do. You don't need more techniques. You don't need more explanations. You don't need more inspiration. You need decision, a quiet internal decision. I will no longer return to the old version of myself. That's it. Because the truth is, the old state only survived because you keep revisiting it. You keep identifying with it. You keep giving it life. But what happens when you simply stop? Not dramatically, not forcefully, just stop going back. You don't argue with it, you don't analyze it, you don't fix it, you just don't be it anymore. And that is power. Because identity is sustained by repetition. Remove repetition, and the identity dissolves. Now here is something subtle but life-changing. You are not becoming someone new. You are revealing who you choose to be, because all states already exist. Confidence exists, wealth exists, love exists, freedom exists. You are not creating them from nothing. You are selecting them. And once selected, you enter them. And once entered, you become them. So the process is not create, wait, receive. It is choose, assume, remain. That's the entire law. Now let's address something honestly. There will be moments when you feel like going back. Moments where the old self feels easier. Moments where doubt feels stronger. Moments where reality pressures you. And in those moments, you have a choice. Return or remain. That is the only decision that matters. Because every time you remain, you strengthen the new state. Every time you return, you reinforce the old one. So progress is not measured by perfection. It is measured by how often you remain. Now here is something most people never realize. You don't need to fix your entire life at once. You only need to stabilize one state at a time. Choose one area, one identity, one shift, and stay there. Because once you prove it to yourself, everything changes. Your confidence grows. Your belief deepens. Your understanding becomes real. And then you apply it everywhere. But it starts with one. So ask yourself, what is one thing I am ready to change right now? Not 10 things, one. Because clarity creates power. Now let's go deeper. There is a moment when the new state becomes so natural that you forget you ever struggled. You forget the old identity. You forget the doubt. You forget the effort. Because it is no longer effort, it is you. And that is when it has fully manifested. Not just outside, but inside. Because true manifestation is not just getting something, it is becoming someone. And once you become it, you cannot lose it. Because it is your state. Now here is the final test. Can you remain in the assumption? Even when nothing around you confirms it yet? That is mastery. Because anyone can believe when they see results. but few can remain before they appear. And that is why few experience real transformation. But if you can stay in the state, if you can live from it, if you can refuse to go back, then it is inevitable. Not possible, not likely, inevitable. Because the law does not fail. It reflects always. Now understand this clearly. You are not hoping for change. You are declaring identity. You are not asking for permission. You are choosing who you are. You are not waiting for life. You are directing it from within. And once you truly accept that, there is no going back. Because you realize you were never powerless. You were just unaware. And now you are aware. So the only question left is, will you use it? Or will you return to the old pattern? Because from this point forward, you cannot say you don't know. You know. And knowing comes with responsibility. Not pressure, but choice. So choose wisely, choose deliberately, choose consistently, because your life is simply the result of what you choose to be. So now we arrive at the simplest truth, and also the most difficult one to live. You already have everything you need. Not later, not after you improve, not after life changes. Now, because the power was never outside you. It was never in circumstances, never in other people, never in timing. It was always in your ability to assume and remain. And if that is true, then your entire life changes from this moment forward. Because now nothing is final. No situation is fixed. No identity is permanent. No limitation is absolute. Everything becomes movable. Why? Because everything is based on state. And state can change. Now take a moment and really feel this. The life you are living right now is not something happening to you. It is something being expressed through you. And that means it can be changed the same way it was created. Through assumption, through persistence, through identity. This is why Neville kept returning to one idea. You are the operant power. Not partially, not sometimes, always. Even when you are unaware, even when you are doubting, even when you feel stuck, you are still operating. The only difference is, are you doing it consciously or unconsciously? Because unconscious creation leads to repetition. Conscious creation leads to transformation. So now you are invited to become conscious. Not occasionally, but intentionally. Now here is the final shift. Stop trying to change your life. Start being the version of you who already has. That is it. Because once you become that person internally, life reorganizes around you. Not by force, but by reflection. And this is where trust becomes real. Not blind belief, not forced positivity, but quiet certainty. And knowing that if I remain in this state, it must appear. Not might, not maybe, must. Because that is the law. Now, let's bring this into something practical. Tonight, when you lie down, don't go to sleep as the old version of yourself. Don't replay the same problems. Don't revisit the same identity. Instead, choose. Decide who you are now. Feel it. Step into it, live in it, and fall asleep in it. Because sleep is not just rest, it is impression. And what you impress, you express. So give yourself a new identity before you drift into that deeper state, and let it take root. Now one last thing. This is not about perfection. You will have moments of doubt, moments of slipping, moments where the old self tries to return. That's normal, but it does not matter. What matters is, where do you return to? Because every time you come back to the new state, you strengthen it. Every time you refuse to go back, you move forward. So don't judge yourself. Don't overthink it. Just return again and again and again until it becomes natural. And when it becomes natural, it becomes real. Now understand this. You don't need to convince the world. You don't need to explain your process. You don't need validation, because this is between you and your own consciousness. And that is where everything begins. So from this moment on, stop waiting, stop doubting, stop observing, and start being, because the version of you that you want to become is not in the future. It is a state. And that state is available right now. So take it, live in it, remain in it, and watch what happens. Because if you do, your life will not just change. It will rearrange itself completely. And one day, you will look back and realize it was never about the world changing. It was about you finally choosing who you are.